I would say why the 14th century.
Yeah.
I trace it to three causes.
Okay.
The first one is the development of Hebrew, non-sacred Hebrew literature and the growth of parody in non-sacred Hebrew literature. We could talk about whether the Bible contains any parody, the Talmud does. There's some quick references here and there. But for whatever they might be, however we might treat them, we don't have much after that. There's no continuous tradition of Hebrew parody that we know of. Once people start writing poetry in Iberia, in the area we now call Spain, right? In the what is called the Golden Age of Spain, you have religious poetry and you have secular poetry, and it uses the biblical idiom, and people are constantly borrowing phrases from the Bible. And I think already that sense of borrowing phrases from the Bible, and especially when it's more secular context, and one of them, by the way, is lots of wine poetry. Many poems about drinking wine. They're serious, but slowly you start to see an emergence of playfulness and joy and even frivolity. And when you're borrowing phrases from the Bible for that, I think it gets more and more playful, where you start to see little tiny pieces of parody. I think there are two other causes. One is the growth of the Latin parody literature, especially with Goliard, the Goliard movement, which is most famously to this day, probably most famous from Carmina Burana. It's a famous manuscript of Goliard literature, and some of those works were set to music by Orff. And the most famous is O Fortuna, which is a famous piece of music that everyone will recognize, even if they don't know the name of. So the Goliard movement of parody. I will note, though, that I think there's a critical difference between Hebrew parody and Latin parody. Many differences, but one really critical, which is that when people hear parody, they often assume it's satire, that there's some critique. And
that's what I assume.
And the Latin literature does definitely seem to have a critique of the clergy, a critique of the people. The Hebrew parody doesn't seem to have a real critique. Maybe a little bit here and there.
It's just playful and funny.
It's just playful. It's just Purim. It's just for Purim. And there's actually a lot of theory that's been written about that too, by Jeff Rubenstein and others before him, about what's the role here. Is it really trying to upend society and the way society is organized, or is it just playful? An affirmation of the roles we play in society in that regard. In some way, as much as we upend things on Purim, ultimately it just serves as an affirmation. But it's not just that there's a Latin parody tradition, which has really come into fruition like 100 or 200 years before this Hebrew parody, while Hebrew parody is still developing. It's also that if you look at these two authors, Kalonymus ben Kalonymus and Gersonides, and where they're living and the connections they have, they both are very, very connected to Christian society. The third, I think, is perhaps the most interesting, which is, what does parody really represent? And, it's Purim now. This is fun to talk about. No one wants to go into theory too much, but I think it is notable to ask, what does parody represent? And what does the Book of Esther represent? Right? The Book of Esther, it's all the unexpected happening. Right, right. The Jews, if you don't do what you're going to do, then the Jews will be rescued from some other source, right? And everything's opposite. The Jewish queen has her identity hidden. She's just known as the queen, and she brings redemption to the Jewish people, through this project where she was taken to the king's home, and somehow she ends up with power and she can save the Jews. We have here, especially in the case of Kalonymus, but also in the case of Gersonides, two Jews who are living a fairly comfortable lifestyle at a time when Jews do not live very comfortable lifestyles. And there's a lot of discomfort for Jews, which I can come back to in a second, who have connections to power and real power. The Pope, the King. Kalonymus can live in Naples when Jews have been banished from there. And he doesn't love living in Naples. He actually asks for special permission to move to Rome so he can hang out with his Jewish buddies. He becomes very close, it seems, with Emmanuel of Rome. Another famous writer, but they have power, they have privilege, which is not experienced by other Jews, because what's going on for the rest of the Jewish community at this time in this area? You have a lot of turmoil.